The silence in my Oregon home isn't empty. It's a thick, heavy thing, woven from 72 years of memories. It smells of damp earth from the garden, Earl Grey tea, and the faint, lingering ghost of my husband Richard's pipe tobacco, a scent that has stubbornly refused to leave the velvet armchair by the fireplace. Most mornings, I welcome it. I sit with my tea, watch the mist burn off the Douglas firs, and feel the quiet settle over me like a well-worn blanket. This morning, the ritual was the same. I'd been out since dawn, tending to the roses. My fingers, gnarled now with age, still knew the delicate work of pruning away the deadwood. I was checking the buds on the Richard's Pride, a deep crimson hybrid he'd cultivated the year before he passed, when the chime echoed from the house. A sharp, digital sound that always felt like an intruder in my analog world. I sighed, wiping my hands on my apron, and went inside. My tablet was glowing on the kitchen table, a bright, insistent rectangle. Jessica's face smiled from the screen. I tapped the green icon, and my quiet world was suddenly filled with life. Grandma! Grandma! Leo's face filled the screen, all tousled brown hair and a missing front tooth. His eyes, the same warm hazel as Richard's, were wide with an excitement that practically vibrated through the pixels. "Hello, my love," I chuckled. "You seem awfully full of energy this morning. It's my birthday next week. I'm gonna be 8. 8, Grandma." He held up 8 fingers, then seemed to realize he was one short and wrangled his thumb into position. Behind him, Jessica's face came into view. She looked tired, I thought, the way she always did these days. There were faint lines of stress around her mouth that her bright, wide smile couldn't quite erase. "Hi, Mom," she said, her voice a little too loud, a little too cheerful. "We were just talking about you." "All good things, I hope," I said, settling into a chair. "The best," Leo shouted, wrestling the tablet back. "You have to come, Grandma. For my party. We're gonna have a bouncy castle and a magician. A real one." I felt a familiar warmth spread through my chest, a deep, aching love for this little boy who was the last living piece of my Richard. He was the reason the silence in my house never truly became lonely. "A magician, you say? I wouldn't miss that for the world." Jessica's face reappeared beside her son's. "I'll book the ticket, Mom. It's on Saturday. Can you fly in Friday? I'll pick you up from O'Hare. We're so excited to have you." Her smile was insistent. "You have to come. Please. It wouldn't be a party without you." For a moment, I saw a flicker in her eyes, something fragile and pleading that had nothing to do with a child's birthday party. I pushed the thought away. I was probably just imagining things. It was a mother's curse to search for shadows where there was only light. "Of course I'll be there, sweetheart," I said. "Just send me the details." Yay! Leo's shout was deafening. "I love you, Grandma. I love you too, my darling boy." The call ended, plunging the kitchen back into its profound quiet. But it wasn't the same. The silence was different now, humming with anticipation. A trip to Chicago. A bouncy castle. My grandson turning 8. I got up and walked into the living room, my hand drifting across the dusty spines of Richard's history books. I stopped in front of the mantelpiece, before the silver-framed photograph of him taken on our 40th anniversary. His eyes were crinkling at the corners, his smile soft and knowing. He always knew what I was thinking. "Did you hear that, Richard?" I whispered to the photograph, my voice a little thick. "He's turning 8. The man in the frame just smiled his silent, reassuring smile. "He needs me there," I continued, tracing the line of his jaw with my fingertip. Jessica sounded thin, like she's stretching herself too far again. I picked up the frame, holding it close. The cold glass was no substitute for his warmth, but it was all I had left. "I have to be there for him, Richard," I said, making a solemn vow to the man in the picture. "For our boy." Preparation for the journey was a ritual of love. The centerpiece was Leo's gift. It sat on the dining room table, a magnificent, 2-foot model of the HMS Victory, Nelson's flagship at Trafalgar. Leo and I had started it last summer, our heads bent close together over the tiny, intricate pieces. His small, clumsy fingers had struggled with the rigging, and I'd shown him how to tie the minuscule knots, my old hands guiding his. We never finished. "Next time, Grandma," he'd said. I had spent the last 2 months finishing it for him. The delicate work of painting the hull, affixing the tiny cannons, and stringing the complex web of rigging had been a conversation with my grandson across 1,000 miles. Now, it was perfect. I packed it with an almost surgical precision, cushioning it in a box with layers of tissue paper that whispered like secrets as I worked. The gift was heavy solid. A promise made tangible. The drive to the Portland airport was a blur of familiar green. The world outside my car window felt lush and alive, a stark contrast to the sterile, recycled air I was heading toward. At security, I felt the familiar, low-grade humiliation of being old. I fumbled with my shoes, my laptop, my coat, holding up the line of impatient business travelers and young families who moved with a fluid ease I no longer possessed. The flight itself was long, punctuated by a layover in Denver where the air was thin and the coffee tasted of bitterness and regret. I sat by the window, watching America unfurl beneath me like a giant, patchwork quilt. I saw other grandmothers on the plane, their faces lit with the same quiet anticipation as mine. I watched families greet each other at the gate in Denver, a cacophony of joyful shouts and tearful hugs that made my heart ache with a sweet, eager pain. Soon, I thought, that will be me. We landed at O'Hare under a sky the color of slate. The Chicago air that hit me as I walked down the jet bridge was cold and damp, carrying the scent of concrete and industry. It was a world away from my Oregon mist. But I was buoyant, my weariness washed away by adrenaline. I was here. I collected my small suitcase and the large, precious box containing the victory. I found a spot with a clear view of the arrival's curb and sent Jessica a text. "Landed safely, my love. At baggage claim 4, near the exit. Can't wait to see you." I waited. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. I watched hundreds of reunions unfold before me. A soldier in uniform was mobbed by 3 small children. A young woman wept in the arms of an older man who I assumed was her father. Each happy scene was a small, sharp pang against my ribs. I told myself she was just running late. Chicago traffic was a nightmare, and she was likely dealing with a house full of children and the last-minute chaos of party preparations. I sent another text. "No rush, sweetheart. I know you must be swamped. I'll just grab a coffee and wait." The coffee was watery and scalded my tongue. An hour bled into 2. The initial crowd of passengers from my flight had long since vanished, replaced by a new wave from a flight from Dallas. The announcements for boarding and final calls became a meaningless drone. I tried calling her. The phone rang once, twice, then clicked. Voicemail. "Jessica, honey, it's Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice light, to betray none of the cold dread that was beginning to seep into my bones. "I'm here. I'm just wondering if I missed you. Call me when you get this." 3 hours. The gift box on my lap now felt less like a treasure and more like an anchor, weighing me down. The joy had completely evaporated, leaving behind a gritty residue of fear. Had there been an accident? Was Leo okay? My mind, the traitorous and over-imaginative thing that it is, began to spin out horrifying scenarios. But another part of me, a colder, more ancient part, whispered a different truth. This wasn't an accident. This was silence. This was deliberate. I couldn't sit there any longer, a forgotten piece of luggage in the bustling terminal. Dignity, Richard always said, is what you do when no one is watching. I stood up, my joints protesting, and walked out into the biting Chicago wind. I hailed a taxi, the yellow car a small beacon in the sprawling gray of the airport. "Where to, ma'am?" the driver asked, his eyes meeting mine in the rearview mirror. I gave him Jessica's address, the words feeling like foreign objects in my mouth. As we pulled away from the curb and merged onto the highway, I watched the airport shrink behind us. I felt like a ship, fully rigged and ready for a grand welcome, sailing foolishly and alone into an unervingly quiet harbor. The taxi ride was a silent journey through a landscape I didn't recognize. We left the city's steel and glass heart behind, spiraling out into the endless, manicured streets of suburban Chicago. Each house was a fortress of beige siding and perfect lawns, each one impossibly similar to the last. My own home, with its wild, rambling garden and peeling paint, felt a world away, a relic from another, more authentic time. The driver pulled up to a two-story colonial that was, if possible, even more immaculate than its neighbors. Lights blazed from every window, spilling warm, golden rectangles onto the perfectly sculpted hedges. I could hear the faint thrum of music and the high-pitched squeals of children's laughter. The party was in full swing. For a fleeting, hopeful second, I thought perhaps they'd simply forgotten me in the joyful chaos, a simple, forgivable oversight. I paid the driver, my hands fumbling with the bills. He helped me with my luggage, setting the suitcase and the large gift box on the pristine concrete walkway. "Have a good night, ma'am," he said, his voice laced with a kindness that almost broke me. Then he was gone, his red taillights disappearing around the corner, leaving me utterly alone. The wind whipped around the corner of the house, sharp and cold. It tugged at my coat and stung my cheeks. I took a deep breath, the air tasting of cut grass and impending winter. I picked up my things, the heavy box a cumbersome weight in my arms, and walked up the 3 neat steps to the front door. A cheerful autumn wreath, woven with synthetic gourds and glossy leaves, hung on the polished oak. It felt like a mockery. I pressed the doorbell. The cheerful, melodic chime was instantly swallowed by the sounds of the party inside. I waited. I could hear footsteps approaching, then a pause. The door swung open. And there was Jessica. She was wearing a silk blouse the color of champagne, and her hair was swept up in an elegant style I'd never seen before. For a fraction of a second, her face lit up with a genuine, reflexive smile. "Mom." Then, as quickly as it appeared, the smile died. It didn't just fade, it was extinguished, snuffed out as if by a sudden gust of wind. Her eyes widened, darting past me to the dark street behind, then back to my face. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving behind a pale mask of pure, unadulterated fear. "Mom," she repeated, but this time it was a whisper, a choked sound of disbelief. "What are you doing here?" Before I could answer, a shadow fell over her from behind. Mark appeared in the doorway, a wine glass held loosely in his hand. He was handsome in that sharp, predatory way some men are, his smile practiced and easy. But his eyes, as they fell on me, were as cold and flat as river stones. "Well, well," he said, his voice smooth and laced with something that sounded like amusement. "Look what the cat dragged in." Jessica flinched. She wouldn't look at me. Her gaze was fixed on a point somewhere over my left shoulder. "Jessica," I said, my own voice sounding surprisingly steady, "I came for Leo's birthday." "You invited me." Mark let out a soft, condescending chuckle. He placed a proprietary hand on Jessica's shoulder, squeezing lightly. I saw her wince. "There must have been a misunderstanding, Eleanor," he said, using my first name in that deliberately casual way that was meant to diminish me. "This is a party for Leo's friends. From school. You understand." I looked from his triumphant smirk to my daughter's terrified, averted face. And I understood everything. The unanswered calls. The hours at the airport. The pleading note in her voice during that first call. It hadn't been an invitation. It had been a cry for help. "Mom, please," Jessica whispered, her voice cracking. "It's just. Mark doesn't want strangers here. It's for the kids." Strangers. The word hung in the cold air between us. I wasn't family. I was a stranger. An inconvenience standing on the welcome mat. I looked past them, into the brightly lit hallway. For a moment, I saw Leo. He was at the far end of the hall, chasing a balloon, his face alight with pure, 8-year-old joy. He hadn't seen me. A wave of relief, so profound it almost buckled my knees, washed over me. Thank God he hadn't seen this. I held my daughter's gaze, forcing her to finally look at me. In her eyes, I saw a deep, bottomless well of shame. I didn't argue. I didn't beg or shout or cry. The shock had burned away all the soft emotions, leaving behind something hard and crystalline. A clarity so sharp it hurt. The door began to close, slowly, pushed by Mark's unseen hand. Jessica's face, a portrait of misery, was framed in the shrinking gap. The last thing I heard before the lock clicked shut was Mark's low, triumphant voice saying, "See? That wasn't so hard, was it? I stood there on the porch for a long time, the laughter from inside the house washing over me. The wind felt colder now. I looked down at the box in my arms, at the model ship that held all my love and all my hope. It was just a box of wood and string now. Slowly, calmly, I turned around. I picked up my suitcase. And I walked away from the house filled with light and laughter, back into the quiet, waiting darkness. The motel was a place stripped of all identity. It smelled of industrial cleaner and the ghosts of 1,000 lonely travelers. The man behind the plexiglass shield barely looked up from his crossword puzzle as he slid a key card across the counter. I was just another anonymous face, a 72-year-old woman with a suitcase and a large, awkward box, seeking refuge for the night. Anonymity, I realized, was exactly what I needed. My room was on the ground floor, facing the humming ice machine. Inside, the air was stale and cold. A single lamp cast a jaundiced glow on the brown-patterned bedspread and the dark, featureless furniture bolted to the walls. It was the kind of room that absorbed sorrow without a trace. I placed my suitcase on the luggage rack and set Leo's gift, the Victory, gently in the center of the bed. It looked like a magnificent shipwreck in a sea of cheap polyester. I didn't cry. The tears were there, frozen somewhere deep in my chest, a solid block of ice that wouldn't melt. What I felt instead was a strange and terrible calm. The kind of calm that comes after the lightning strike, when the air is still charged and smells of ozone. I ordered a black coffee from a 24-hour diner next door. When it arrived in a flimsy paper cup, I sat in the room's single, uncomfortable chair and held the warmth in my hands, letting it seep into my frozen fingers. I replayed the scene at the door. Jessica's panicked face. Mark's triumphant sneer. The word he used, strangers. It wasn't a whim. It wasn't a simple, cruel impulse born of a bad mood. It was a strategy. A calculated severing. Mark wasn't just closing a door, he was drawing a battle line. For years, I had watched him. I saw how he subtly isolated Jessica, how his compliments were always backhanded, how his generosity always came with strings. Richard had seen it, too. He's a taker, Eleanor, he'd said to me one evening, long ago, after a visit from the young couple. And takers will keep taking until there's nothing left. We have to make sure he can never take what matters. What mattered wasn't the house or the cars. It was Jessica's freedom. Leo's future. And in that sterile, soulless motel room, the memory of Richard's words became a plan. The ice in my chest began to crack, not with tears, but with a cold, righteous fury. This man had turned my daughter into a frightened gatekeeper at her own home. He had weaponized my grandson's birthday against me. He saw me as a doddering old fool, a nuisance to be swatted away. He had no idea who I was. He had no idea who Richard was. I finished my coffee and set the cup down with a decisive click. The old, fragile woman who had waited for hours at the airport was gone. In her place was someone else. Someone Richard would have called his Eleanor of Aquitaine, a queen defending her territory. I reached into my handbag and pulled out my phone. My hands were perfectly steady. I opened a new message to Jessica. My thumbs, usually clumsy on the small screen, moved with a strange precision. I didn't write a long, pleading appeal or an angry accusation. I typed a single, simple sentence, a key Richard and I had forged years ago for a lock she didn't even know existed. A phrase that sounded like a simple, sentimental memory, but was, in fact, an emergency flare. I hope you remember where we kept the key to the old rose garden. I read it once, then pressed send. The message disappeared into the ether with a soft whoosh. Then I did the most important thing. I held down the side button on my phone until the screen prompted me, and I turned the ringer to silent. I placed the phone face down on the nightstand. The trap was set. Now, all I had to do was wait for the storm to break. And I knew, with the certainty of a gardener who knows the coming frost, that it would be a hurricane. I did not sleep. I sat in the hard-backed chair, a silent sentinel in the sterile room. I methodically unpacked my small suitcase, hanging my 2 spare blouses in the cramped closet and arranging my toiletries on the clean, cold counter of the bathroom. The actions were mundane, normal, an anchor in the swirling chaos of the evening. On the dresser, the HMS Victory stood in the dim light, its tiny masts and rigging a testament to a love my grandson was being denied. It watched me, a silent, unjudging observer. Exactly 2 hours after I sent the text, I picked up my phone. It was cold and inert in my hand. I took a breath, held it, and flipped the small switch on the side, turning the ringer back on. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The phone didn't just ring, it convulsed. It began to vibrate so furiously against the Formica nightstand that it sounded like an angry hornet trapped in a jar. The screen lit up, a frantic, flashing strobe of notifications. A tidal wave of information, a digital scream. There were 17 missed calls. 5 were from a blocked number. That was Mark. He was too much of a coward to use his own. There were over 30 text messages, a chaotic jumble of threats, pleas, and accusations. I didn't read them. They were just noise. And then there were the 12 calls from Jessica. As I watched, her name flashed on the screen again. This time I answered. I didn't say anything. I just listened. Mom? Oh my God, Mom, what did you do? Her voice was a ragged, hysterical sob, thin and breaking. In the background, I could hear Mark shouting, his voice a muffled, guttural roar. It wasn't words, just pure, undiluted rage. What did that text mean? Jessica cried, her words tumbling over each other. The rose garden key? He saw it and he went insane. He's tearing the house apart. What did you do? Jessica, I said, my own voice so low and steady it surprised me. It sounded like it belonged to someone else, a commander on a distant battlefield. Jessica, listen to me. He's screaming about lawyers, about his money. Mom, I'm scared. The sound of something smashing in the background, glass or porcelain, made me flinch. I know you are. Now you are going to listen to my voice and do exactly as I say, I commanded, cutting through her panic with a blade of pure authority. Where are you right now? I'm locked in the guest bathroom. Good. Does the window open? Yes, but... This is not a discussion, Jessica. This is an instruction. Get your purse. Get your car keys and your documents, your driver's license, your passport if you have it. Go out that window. Do not go back into the house. Go to your car and drive to the coffee shop on the corner of Elm and Main. The one with the green awning. Go inside, order a tea, and call me back from there. Do you understand? There was a moment of choked silence, then a shuddering sob. Yes. Okay. Mom. Go now, I said, and ended the call. I stood up, my own heart finally beginning to hammer against my ribs. The first part was done. My daughter was in motion. She was moving away from the blast radius. Now for the second part. I scrolled through my contacts to a name I hadn't called in 3 years. My finger hovered over it, a silent prayer on my lips. I pressed the screen. It rang twice. Arthur, a calm, deep voice answered. A voice of reason and old leather-bound books. Arthur, it's Eleanor Vance. There was a short pause. I could hear the gentle clink of ice in a glass. Eleanor, he said, his voice laced with a weary warmth. I was hoping I wouldn't get this call. Is she safe? The question told me everything. He knew. He had always been waiting for this. She will be, I replied, my voice hard as granite now. I looked across the room at the proud, silent ship on the dresser. Arthur, it's time. Another pause, shorter this time, followed by a heavy sigh. Understood, he said. I'll get the ball rolling. Activate the Rosewood Protocol. The words felt momentous, heavy with the weight of years of planning, of Richard's foresight, of my own quiet, desperate love. Consider it done, Eleanor, Arthur said. The roses are about to show their thorns. As I waited for Jessica's call, the motel room seemed to fade away. I was transported back in time, to my own sun-drenched living room in Oregon, years ago. The air was thick with the scent of Richard's pipe and the dust motes dancing in the late afternoon light. He was sitting in his worn velvet armchair, a heavy ledger open on his lap. He wasn't a history teacher then. He was the architect of our hidden world. To everyone in our small town, Richard Vance was a quiet, scholarly man. He taught American history at the local high school for 30 years. He graded papers at the kitchen table, coached the debate team, and was known for his gentle demeanor and his encyclopedic knowledge of the Civil War. He drove a modest Ford, and our biggest extravagance was our annual trip to the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. People saw us as a nice, ordinary, retired couple, living comfortably but simply on a teacher's pension. It was a perfect disguise. The truth was, Richard was a genius. Not a loud, ostentatious one, but a quiet, patient one. In the late 1970s, long before Silicon Valley was a household name, he had started investing. He'd read an obscure article about a new technology called the microprocessor. While others saw curiosity, Richard saw the future. He took our small savings, a few $1,000s we had painstakingly put away, and invested it in two small, unknown companies. One was called Intel. The other was Apple. He never sold. He held on, reinvesting dividends, studying market trends with the same meticulous attention he gave to the battle plans of Gettysburg. And I was his partner. My mind wasn't built for numbers, but I had something else, an intuition for people. I could read a CEO's letter to the shareholders and see the lie hiding behind the corporate jargon. I could sense the hubris or the quiet confidence in a company's mission statement. He was the strategist, I was the scout. Together, hidden away in our quiet little house, we built a fortress. We never told Jessica. It wasn't because we didn't trust her, but because we loved her. We'd seen what sudden wealth did to other families, turning children into entitled dependents, attracting predators who could smell money like sharks smell blood. We wanted her to find her own way, to build a life based on her own merits, not on a trust fund. We gave her a wonderful education, a down payment for her first home, and our unconditional love. We thought that would be enough armor. But we hadn't accounted for Mark. The day Jessica brought him home, my intuition screamed. He was charming, of course. He complimented my garden, praised my cooking, and listened to Richard's stories with rapt attention. But his eyes were empty. They were constantly scanning, assessing, calculating. When he looked at our simple home, he wasn't seeing a lifetime of love and memories. He was seeing assets. That evening, after they left, Richard and I sat in silence for a long time. "He's a wolf," I finally said, the words tasting bitter. Richard just nodded, tamping down the tobacco in his pipe. "I know," he said softly. "But she loves him. And we can't protect her heart from her own choices." He looked at me, his gaze clear and serious. "But we can protect her future. And our grandsons." That was the night the Rosewood Protocol was born. Named after the street we lived on, it was a complex, layered system of trusts and holding companies, designed by Arthur Coleman to be an impenetrable financial bulwark. On the surface, Jessica had access to a modest trust fund, enough for emergencies and to supplement her income. But the vast majority of our fortune, an amount that would have shocked our friends and neighbors to their core, was locked away in the main Rosewood Trust. And the sole, absolute, non-negotiable trustee, the only person with the power to move, to invest, or to dissolve the funds, was me. Jessica could only inherit full control under one of two conditions: my death or my signed, notarized declaration that she was in a safe and stable position to manage it herself. The key to the old rose garden was our prearranged distress signal. It was a phrase that meant the wolf was no longer just circling the house. He was trying to tear down the door. It was the signal for me to unleash the thorns we had so carefully cultivated. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling me from the past. It was Jessica. "Mom," her voice was a trembling whisper, but the hysteria was gone. "Are you safe?" I asked. "Yes. I'm at the coffee shop." She trailed off. "I don't understand what's happening." "You don't need to understand everything right now, sweetheart," I said, my voice softening. "You just need to trust me. The way you trusted me when you were a little girl and you were afraid of the dark." I heard her take a shaky breath. "Okay, Mom. I trust you." "Good," I said. "Because the lights are about to come on." The next morning, the digital assault began anew, but the tone had shifted. Mark's blocked calls stopped. Instead, a single text message appeared. It was a novel of contrition, a masterclass in manipulation. Eleanor, I am so deeply, profoundly ashamed of my behavior last night. I have no excuse. The stress of the party, a few too many glasses of wine. I acted like a monster. I know I've broken your trust, and more importantly, I've hurt Jess, the woman I love more than life itself. Please, can we meet? Just for a coffee? Let me apologize in person. Let me begin to make this right. For Jess. For Leo. For the family. It was a beautiful performance. I could almost hear the tremble in his voice as he typed it. He was moving from intimidation to seduction, from a frontal assault to a flanking maneuver. He thought he was dealing with a sentimental old woman who could be swayed by an appeal to family. He was making another critical miscalculation. I agreed to meet him. Not because I believed a word he said, but because I needed to see him. I needed to look into his eyes and take his measure now that he knew the game had changed. I chose the venue, the grand, cavernous lobby of a historic downtown Chicago hotel. It was public, busy, and neutral ground. A place where a man like Mark couldn't afford to make a scene. I arrived early and chose a seat in a small alcove, 2 plush armchairs facing each other across a low marble table. I ordered a pot of tea and waited. He was exactly 10 minutes late, a classic power move, meant to make me feel anxious. He approached my table with a practiced, solemn expression. He dressed for the part in a tailored blazer and dark jeans, looking less like a suburban dad and more like a chastened CEO. He was holding a single, long-stemmed white rose. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. "Eleanor," he said, his voice a low, respectful murmur. He offered me the rose. A peace offering. I didn't take it. I simply gestured to the chair opposite me. "Sit down, Mark." He placed the rose on the table between us, a stark white line drawn in the sand. He leaned forward, his hands clasped, his face a mask of earnest sincerity. "I don't know what to say," he began. "There are no words to express how sorry I am for the way I treated you. It was unforgivable." "Then why are you trying to ask for forgiveness?" I asked, my voice cool and even. He blinked, thrown off balance for a microsecond. Because I love your daughter. And I know she's hurting because I hurt you. I was a brute. I see that now. The pressure. We've had some financial setbacks lately. I've been carrying it all on my own, trying to shield Jessica from it. It all just boiled over. He was good. He was very good. He mixed his lies with just enough truth to make them plausible. The financial setbacks. I knew that was the heart of it. "I see," I said, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. "It must be very difficult, trying to maintain this lifestyle." I gestured vaguely at the opulent lobby around us. The big house, the private school for Leo, the parties. He saw an opening and seized it. "Exactly. You understand. That's all I want, to provide for them. To give them the life they deserve. Sometimes I make mistakes. In judgment." I set my cup down, the porcelain making a soft clink against the saucer. The sound seemed to echo in the space between us. "Speaking of judgment, Mark," I said, shifting my tone slightly, sharpening the edge. "I was having a conversation with my financial advisor this morning. Just a routine check-in. And a curious document came up. A home equity line of credit application. Against your house." The mask didn't just slip. It shattered. For a split second, I saw the real Mark. The panic in his eyes was cold and reptilian. His jaw tightened, and a muscle jumped along his cheek. He recovered almost instantly, but I had seen it. The truth. I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, his smooth composure fracturing. That's a private matter." "Is it?" I countered, my voice still quiet. "Because the house was purchased with a significant gift from the Vance Family Trust. And that gift came with certain legal stipulations. Stipulations that would, for instance, prevent the property from being used as collateral without the express consent of the trustee." I paused, letting the word hang in the air. "That would be me." His face, which had been a carefully constructed portrait of remorse, was now pale and tight with fury. The charming, apologetic son-in-law was gone. The predator was here. "You have no right," he hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You have no idea what you're meddling in. This is my family. My life. You made it my business, Mark, I said, leaning forward for the first time, my own voice dropping to match his. You made it my business when you left me standing on your doorstep. You thought I was just some dotty old woman you could push aside. You thought the money would just fall into your lap when I was gone. I picked up the white rose from the table. The thorns had been neatly clipped off, making it smooth and harmless. You underestimated me, I said, looking him directly in the eye. And you have absolutely no idea how big a mistake that was. I placed the rose back on the table, stood up, and walked away without another word, leaving him sitting there amidst the ruins of his own deception. The coffee shop on the corner of Elm and Main was a small, independent place that smelled of roasted beans and cinnamon. It was a world away from the cold grandeur of the hotel lobby. Here, the tables were mismatched wood, and local art adorned the brick walls. It was a place for quiet conversations, a sanctuary. Jessica was already there, huddled in a booth in the back corner. She had a large, untouched mug of tea in front of her, and she was staring into it as if it held the answers to the universe. She looked small and fragile, like a bird that had flown into a window. The confident, champagne-sipping hostess from the party was gone, replaced by the scared, uncertain daughter I knew was hiding underneath. I slid into the booth opposite her. She looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and full of 100 unspoken questions. "Hi, Mom," she whispered. I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. Her skin was ice-cold. "Hi, sweetheart." We sat in silence for a few moments. The barista frothed milk behind the counter, the sound a gentle hiss that filled the quiet space between us. I didn't push. I knew she needed to find the words herself. Finally, she took a shaky breath. "He's been different. For a long time now." I didn't want to see it. Her confession started as a trickle. It started small. Comments about my friends, saying they were a bad influence. Suggestions that I quit my part-time job at the gallery because he could take care of us. I thought it was romantic. Protective. She looked up at me, her eyes pleading for understanding. "He can be so charming, Mom. So loving. When we're good, we're so good." I kept holding on to those moments, thinking the other stuff, the anger, the control, was just stress from his job. "What other stuff, Jess?" I asked gently. The trickle became a stream. He took over the finances completely. Said I wasn't good with numbers. My credit card statements started going to his email. He gave me an allowance, like a child. If I questioned him, he'd get this cold look in his eyes and say I didn't trust him. He'd make me feel guilty. Stupid. She pulled her hand away and wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture of self-protection. The last few months have been worse. He's on his phone all the time, secret calls. Bills started showing up, final notices. When I asked, he just exploded. He said I was trying to undermine him. That I was ungrateful for the life he gave me. The dam broke. Tears streamed down her face, silent and hot. That night, the party. He told me you were coming to judge us. To criticize the way we were raising Leo. He said if I really loved him and our family, I would prove my loyalty. He made me. He told me what to say at the door. Her voice cracked on the final admission. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I was so scared of what he would do if I didn't." My own heart ached, not with anger at her, but with a fierce, burning rage at him. He had systematically dismantled her confidence, isolated her, and turned her into a prisoner in her own beautiful home. "You have nothing to be sorry for," I said, my voice thick with emotion. I reached for her hand again, and this time she clung to it like a lifeline. "He did this. Not you." I leaned forward. "Jessica, there's something I have to tell you. Something your father and I should have told you a long time ago." I told her everything. Not about the specifics of the market or the numbers that I barely understood myself, but about the why. About their desire to give her a normal life, about their fear of the corrosive power of unearned wealth. I told her about Richard's genius and his quiet, fierce love for her. And I told her about the Rosewood Protocol. I explained that the modest trust she knew about was just a single, small branch of a very large, very old tree. A tree whose roots were deep and strong. The house you live in, the car you drive, Leo's school tuition. It doesn't come from Mark's salary, sweetheart, I said softly. It comes from the trust. Your father structured it that way. It was his way of providing for you, even after he was gone. She stared at me, her tear-filled eyes wide with disbelief, confusion, and the dawning of a terrifying new understanding. The money, she whispered. Mark said it was all from his investments. No, my love, I said, squeezing her hand. It was never his. And he has no control over it. None at all. In that moment, in the quiet corner of a neighborhood coffee shop, the walls of Jessica's prison began to crumble. She wasn't just the wife of a powerful, successful man. She wasn't stupid or bad with numbers. She was the beneficiary of a legacy of love and foresight. And for the first time in a very long time, she was holding the key. Returning to the motel felt like crossing back into enemy territory. The fragile hope kindled in the coffee shop was a tiny flame I had to shield against the coming storm. I left Jessica with a list of instructions and the number of a family lawyer in Chicago Arthur had recommended, the first step in building her own fortifications. She had hugged me tightly, a real hug, full of a strength I hadn't felt in her for years. I love you, Mom, she'd said, her voice clear for the first time. Thank you. The sun was setting as my taxi pulled into the motel's cracked parking lot. The neon sign sputtered, casting a sickly pink glow on the damp asphalt. A cold wind was picking up, rattling the bare branches of a lonely tree near my room. I paid the driver and hurried toward my door, clutching my purse, an old woman seeking the flimsy security of a chain lock. I never made it. He stepped out from the shadows between the ice machine and the wall, a solid, menacing form materializing from the gloom. For a moment, my heart seized in my chest, a purely primal flight response. It was Mark. But this wasn't the polished, repentant Mark from the hotel lobby, or the sneering, confident Mark from the doorstep. This was someone else entirely. His blazer was gone, his shirt was rumpled and untucked, and his eyes were wild, bloodshot, and burning with a desperate, cornered animal rage. He spat, the word a piece of poison. He closed the distance between us in 2 long strides, backing me up against the cold brick wall of the building. You think you're so clever, don't you? He snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He smelled of stale sweat and something else, something acrid, pure fury. Playing your little games. Turning my wife against me. Your wife? I said, my own voice dangerously quiet. Jessica stopped being your wife and started being your prisoner a long time ago. You just didn't realize it. His face contorted. She's nothing without me. I gave her everything. You gave her a gilded cage, Mark. And you've been living off the birdseed your father-in-law left for her. That was it. The final truth. It hit him like a physical blow. He lunged forward and his hand shot out, clamping around my upper arm like a vice. His fingers dug into my flesh, hard and painful. I gasped, not from fear, but from the shock of the violation. You will give me access to that money, you old witch, he hissed, his face inches from mine. You will sign whatever papers I tell you to sign. You will undo this, or I swear to God, you will regret ever getting on that plane. I didn't struggle. I didn't scream. I looked directly into his frantic, hateful eyes and felt a profound and chilling pity. He was nothing. A hollow man, a parasite about to be severed from its host. It's over, Mark, I said, my voice as cold and steady as the concrete beneath my feet. You've lost. His grip tightened, and for the first time, a flicker of genuine alarm went through me. His control was completely gone. He was capable of anything. And then, a calm voice cut through the tense, violent air. I would advise you to take your hand off my client, Mr. Henderson. Mark froze. His head whipped around. I followed his gaze. A dark sedan had pulled silently into the parking space opposite us. Standing by the open driver's door was Arthur Coleman. He looked just as I remembered him, tall, impeccably dressed in a dark suit despite the late hour, his silver hair neatly combed. He looked like an undertaker or a judge. Next to him, a second, much younger and broader man had emerged from the passenger side. He said nothing, simply stood with his arms crossed, a silent, imposing presence. Mark's hand dropped from my arm as if he'd been burned. The blood drained from his face, replaced by a pasty, sickly white. The rage in his eyes was instantly replaced by something else, fear. He was a bully who had just run into the principal, the police, and the entire school board all at once. "Who the hell are you?" Mark stammered, trying to regain some semblance of authority. "I am Eleanor's attorney," Arthur said, his voice level and devoid of emotion. He took a step forward, his polished shoes crunching softly on the gravel. "And this is a formal warning. If you come near my client again, if you contact her in any way, we will file for a restraining order so fast your head will spin. And that," he added, his gaze flicking to the red marks forming on my arm, "will be the least of your legal troubles. Am I clear?" Mark stared, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish gasping for air. He was completely outmatched, outmaneuvered, and he knew it. He shot one last look at me, a look of pure, undiluted venom. "You'll regret this, old witch," he whispered, a final, impotent threat. Then he turned and practically fled, stumbling away into the darkness of the parking lot, his bravado utterly shattered. Arthur walked over to me, his expression softening with concern. "Are you all right, Eleanor?" I looked at my arm, at the 4 angry red marks his fingers had left behind. They were already beginning to bruise. "Yes, Arthur," I said, finally letting out a long, shuddering breath. "I'm fine." I looked at him, my old friend, my trusted ally. "But I think it's time we stopped playing defense." Arthur escorted me to a different hotel, a discreet, high-end establishment where the staff spoke in hushed tones and anonymity was a commodity. My new room didn't overlook an ice machine. It had a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline, a glittering tapestry of a million distant lives. The space was no longer a bunker, but a command center. Jessica arrived half an hour later, her face pale, but her eyes resolute. She hugged me first, then shook Arthur's hand with a new, firm confidence. The 3 of us gathered around the polished mahogany table in the suite's small sitting area. It felt like a council of war. Arthur opened his leather briefcase with a soft, satisfying click and laid out a series of documents on the table. He was no longer just the kind, elderly friend of the family. He was Arthur Coleman, Esquire, a man known in certain circles for his quiet, methodical, and utterly ruthless litigation. First, he began, his voice calm and precise, the good news. "The Rosewood Protocol's primary firewalls have held perfectly. Mark has no access and no legal claim to any of the principal assets. He has, however, been dangerously close to breaching the secondary defenses." He slid a document across the table. It was a copy of the home equity line of credit application I had mentioned to Mark. But it was worse than I had imagined. "This wasn't just an application," Arthur explained. "This is a signed agreement, pending final bank approval. He forged your signature, Jessica." Jessica stared at the spidery, unfamiliar scrawl at the bottom of the page. It was a clumsy imitation of her fluid handwriting. A wave of nausea washed over her. He told me it was a refinancing application for a better interest rate." I thought. She trailed off, shaking her head in disgust. "I can't believe I was so stupid." "You weren't stupid, my dear," Arthur said, his tone gentle but firm. "You were manipulated. There is a profound difference. The fact that he had to resort to forgery proves your inherent strength, not your weakness. He knew you would never have agreed." He then produced another file. "My investigators have been busy. Mark's private investment firm, Henderson Capital, is a house of cards. He's leveraged to the hilt, taken out high-interest loans against projected earnings that have never materialized. He's been using the monthly distributions from your trust as his only real cash flow to keep the whole charade afloat. According to our projections, he's less than a month from total insolvency. This loan against the house wasn't just a whim. It was a last, desperate move to keep from drowning." A heavy silence filled the room. The full scope of Mark's deception was breathtaking. He hadn't just been controlling, he had been building a fantasy life on a foundation of lies, all funded by my husband's legacy. I looked at my daughter. She was staring at the forged signature, her expression hardening from shock to a cold, clear anger. The fear was gone. The shame was gone. In their place was a resolve as hard as steel. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice low and steady. She looked from Arthur to me. It wasn't the question of a victim. It was the question of a general. "We present him with two choices," Arthur said, leaning back in his chair. "Option A, the amicable path. You file for divorce on the grounds of irreconcilable differences. We draw up a separation agreement. He walks away with his personal effects, his considerable debts, and a gag order that prevents him from ever discussing the Vance family or its finances. In return, we do not press charges for forgery and fraud." "And option B?" Jessica asked. "Option B," Arthur said, his eyes glinting in the lamplight, "is war. We hand over the forgery evidence to the district attorney. We file a civil suit for recovery of any trust funds he has misappropriated. We dismantle Henderson Capital piece by piece in court. It will be public, it will be ugly, and it will be financially and reputationally annihilating for him. But it is well within our rights." He let the two options hang in the air. This was her decision. Not mine, not Arthur's. This was the first and most important act of her new, independent life. Jessica was quiet for a long time, her gaze distant, looking out at the city lights. I saw a decade of her life playing out behind her eyes, the good moments and the bad, the love she thought she had, and the lies she now knew were true. When she finally turned back to us, her decision was made. "He threatened my mother," she said, her voice devoid of any hesitation. "He put his hands on her. He built our entire life on a lie and called me a fool for believing it." She looked at Arthur, her jaw set. "There will be no amicable path," she said. "I choose war." The final confrontation was set for the following evening. We chose the battlefield, her home. It was a strategic decision. On that ground, Mark was an intruder, not a host. It was a place he was about to be evicted from, both literally and figuratively. We took precautions. Leo was sent on a surprise pre-birthday sleepover with a trusted school friend's family, his mind filled with happy thoughts of cake and presents, blissfully unaware of the tectonic plates shifting beneath his life. Arthur's quiet, broad-shouldered assistant, a former police detective named David, was stationed in a discreet car down the street, a silent promise of security. Mark arrived expecting a negotiation, perhaps even a tearful reconciliation brokered by his repentant wife. He clearly believed that Jessica, left to her own devices for a day, would have lost her nerve and come crawling back. He walked into the living room with a weary, put-upon sigh, ready to play the part of the magnanimous husband willing to forgive his family's foolishness. Instead, he found the three of us waiting for him. I was seated in a wingback chair by the cold, dark fireplace. Arthur stood beside me, his leather briefcase on the coffee table. And Jessica stood in the center of the room, her arms crossed, her posture radiating a calm, unshakable authority he had never seen in her before. The calculated look of paternal concern on his face evaporated, replaced by a sneer. "Oh, this is fantastic," he said, sarcasm dripping from his voice. "The whole coven is here. What is this, an intervention? Did you decide to give me back my life?" "This is not your life, Mark," Jessica said, her voice clear and steady, echoing in the unnervingly quiet house. "It's mine. And you are no longer welcome in it." Arthur stepped forward and opened his briefcase. He didn't speak. He simply began laying documents on the polished surface of the coffee table, one by one. The forged loan agreement. Bank statements showing massive transfers from their joint account to Henderson Capital. A preliminary report from a forensic accountant, its pages filled with damning red ink. Mark stared at the growing pile of paper, his bravado beginning to crack. "This is garbage. It's a trick." "There is no trick, Mr. Henderson," Arthur said coolly. "This is evidence. Evidence of wire fraud, bank fraud, and forgery, to start. The district attorney's office tends to find such evidence quite compelling." Mark's gaze shot to Jessica, his eyes wild with disbelief and fury. "You wouldn't," he hissed. "You would not do this to me. To our family. To Leo." "You are the one who did this, Mark," Jessica replied, her voice unwavering. She took a step toward him. "You did it every time you lied to me. Every time you made me feel small so you could feel big. You did it when you turned me against my own mother. You destroyed our family. I am just cleaning up the wreckage. That was when he finally, truly broke. The charming facade, the intimidating rage, the practiced contrition, it all fell away, revealing the terrified, hollow man underneath. His face crumpled. "Jess, please," he begged, his voice suddenly pathetic, whining. "Don't do this. I'm ruined. Everything's gone. You can't just throw me out. I love you. I love Leo." "No," Jessica said, the word a final, clean cut. "You don't love us. You love what we provided for you. A cover. An allowance. A life you didn't earn." He lunged then, not at her, but at the table, trying to sweep the papers away as if destroying the proof would destroy the truth. But his desperation only made him clumsy. He stumbled, catching his foot on the leg of the coffee table, and fell to his knees. He stayed there on the plush, expensive rug he had bought with her money, a man utterly defeated. He looked up at her, his face a mess of self-pity and impotent rage. Jessica looked down at him, not with hatred, not with pity, but with a profound and sorrowful finality. "A process server will be here in the morning with the divorce papers and a temporary restraining order," she said, her voice as calm as a judge delivering a verdict. "My lawyer will be in touch with your lawyer. Now get your things. And get out of my house." He didn't argue. He didn't shout. The fight was gone, bled out of him on the living room floor. He simply got to his feet, a man suddenly aged by a decade, and walked upstairs. We heard drawers opening and closing, the dull thud of a suitcase being packed. The sounds were mundane, domestic, yet they were the sounds of a life being surgically excised. Jessica stood frozen in the center of the room, listening to every sound, her body as taut as a bowstring. I didn't move from my chair. I simply watched her, giving her the space to feel the seismic shift that was occurring in her world. Arthur quietly gathered the documents from the table, his movements precise and respectful, a silent custodian of her painful victory. 20 minutes later, Mark came down the stairs, carrying a single suitcase and a briefcase. He didn't look at any of us. His face was a pale, blank mask. He walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped out into the night. The door clicked shut behind him, the sound impossibly loud in the ensuing silence. He was gone. For a long moment, nobody moved. The house, which had moments before been charged with the electric tension of confrontation, was now utterly, profoundly still. It was the kind of silence that follows a hurricane, when the wind has died and the air is heavy and strange. Then a shudder went through Jessica's body. A single, dry sob escaped her lips, a sound of such raw, ragged pain that it pierced the quiet like a shard of glass. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the sofa, burying her face in her hands. And she wept. It wasn't the hysterical crying of before. This was a deep, guttural grief, a flood of tears held back for years. She cried for the man she thought she had married, for the love she thought they had shared. She cried for the lies she had believed and the truths she had ignored. She cried for the lost years, for the stolen confidence, for the hollow core of her beautiful, perfect life. I went to her then. I sat down on the sofa beside her and simply wrapped my arms around her shaking shoulders. I didn't say, "I told you so." I didn't say, "You'll be better off." I didn't say anything at all. There were no words that could heal this kind of wound. There was only presence. Only the silent, unconditional love of a mother holding her child as she grieved the death of a life. Arthur gave a small, respectful nod from the doorway. "I'll let myself out, Eleanor," he murmured. "Call me tomorrow." And he was gone, leaving us alone in the quiet wreckage. We sat like that for a long time as the night deepened outside. I held her as she cried until there were no tears left, only shuddering, exhausted breaths. When she finally quieted, she didn't pull away. She just leaned her head against my shoulder, the way she used to when she was a little girl who'd had a bad dream. "What now?" she whispered into the fabric of my sweater, her voice raspy and broken. "Now," I said softly, stroking her hair. "Now we rest. And tomorrow, we begin to sweep up the glass." I stayed in Chicago for the next 3 weeks. I moved out of the hotel and into the guest room of her house, a room I had never been invited to stay in before. We navigated the initial, ugly logistics of the divorce. We changed the locks. We took Leo out of his expensive private school and enrolled him in a wonderful public one nearby. We started packing up Mark's things, sorting through a decade of shared life and sealing it away in labeled cardboard boxes. Each action was a small step away from the past. With every box taped shut, a little more of his ghost was exorcised from the house. And with every passing day, I watched my daughter slowly, painstakingly, begin to come back to life. 6 months passed. The Oregon autumn had given way to a wet, mild winter, and now the first hints of spring were stubbornly pushing through the damp earth. My garden was waking up. I stood in the soft morning light, my old secateur in hand, inspecting the rose bushes. They were covered in new, crimson-tipped leaves, promises of the blooms to come. My tablet chimed from its place on the small iron table by the back door. I smiled, wiping the dirt from my hands onto my apron, and walked over to answer it. Leo's face, now with 2 new adult teeth proudly filling the gaps, beamed at me. "Grandma, look." He flipped the camera around. He was standing in a small, slightly chaotic backyard. Behind him, Jessica was on her hands and knees, wrestling a stubborn-looking azalea bush into a newly dug hole. She looked up, smearing a streak of mud across her forehead, and grinned. It was a real grin, tired and genuine and utterly beautiful. "Hi, Mom," she said, panting slightly. "Welcome to our new jungle." They had sold the big house in Chicago. The proceeds, once Mark's fraudulent debts were cleared, had been more than enough to buy a smaller, charming brick bungalow in a quiet, tree-lined suburb north of the city. It had a big, unruly yard that had been neglected for years. It was perfect. "It looks wonderful, sweetheart," I said, and I meant it. The house wasn't a statement. It was a home. "Mom's learning how to be a gardener," Leo announced. She read a book. Jessica laughed, a sound that was rich and free. "I'm trying. I signed up for a landscape design course at the community college. It starts next month." My heart swelled. It was a dream she'd had in high school, a path she had abandoned when she met Mark, who had called it a silly hobby and not a real career. "Dad would be so proud of you," I said, my voice a little thick. "I think about that a lot," she said, her smile softening. "About what he and you built for us. Not the money, Mom. The safety net. The freedom to start over." We talked for another 20 minutes about Leo's new friends, about the leaky faucet in her kitchen, about the best kind of fertilizer for acidic soil. It was a normal conversation, beautifully, blessedly normal. There were no hidden currents, no words left unsaid. "Gotta go, Grandma," Leo said finally. "We have to go get my birthday present." My breath caught. Of course. It was his birthday. Not his 8th, but his 8th and a half. A small, private celebration. The real one. "Happy birthday, my darling boy," I said. "I have something for you here. I'll send it tomorrow." "Okay. Love you." "I love you too." The screen went dark. I stood for a moment, looking at my own reflection in the blank screen, an old woman in a muddy apron, alone in her quiet garden. But the silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful, filled with the hum of a life well lived and a love that had proven strong enough to cross 1,000 miles and tear down prison walls. My gaze fell upon the Richards Pride. It was a hardy, resilient rose, but I noticed a single, thin branch near the bottom that was pale and withered. It was draining energy from the rest of the plant, producing no leaves, offering no promise of a flower. It was deadwood. Without hesitation, I reached down with my secateur. The tool was old and sharp. I positioned the blades at the base of the sick branch and squeezed. There was a clean, decisive snip. The dead branch fell away onto the soft earth. I picked it up and carried it over to the compost heap at the far end of the garden. As I tossed it onto the pile of decaying leaves and old cuttings, a final thought settled in my mind, as clear and true as the spring air. Sometimes, for a garden to truly thrive, you have to be ruthless. You have to cut away the parts that are dying, the parts that are diseased, to make room for new growth. No matter how much a part of the plant they once were. No matter how much it hurts.